Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this meeting of the Policy Committee. As per usual, we are broadcasting via Microsoft Teams, so some colleagues will be joining us online, and others, of course, are here in the room because the coronavirus regulations that allowed us to meet remotely have lapsed and not been renewed by the government. There is a public speaking microphone which will be used this evening. It is not on camera, however, and if I could remind everybody to put their microphones on when they speak. I'm going to stop now because I feel like I've begun to ramble. So any declarations of interest? Councillor Ennis?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Item number 10 and 11, I'd like to declare an interest as I am the Chair of Reading YOS. And
that is non-pecuniary, so you'll be able to join us. Thank you, Councillor Ennis. Councillor Terry?
Thank you, Chair. Declaring interest in item 6. I'm one of the council's appointees to Citizens Advice. It's a non-pecuniary interest, but I've actually declared my interest to Citizens Advice so I can take part in debate at council. Wonderful.
Thank you, Councillor Terry. Councillor McEwen?
Thank you, Chair. Again, item number 6. I'm a trustee for Reading Welfare Rights. So it's a non-pecuniary interest.
And the same situation as Councillor Terry, so you'll be able to join us. Thank you. Councillor Rowland?
Thank you, Chair. I am claiming an interest also in item number 6. My interests are non-pecuniary, but I am a trustee in 3 organizations, council-appointed trustee at Queen Victoria Institute, along with serving as a trustee for Reading Association for the Blind and Reading Community Learning Center. Due to the nature of small organizations discussing funding, I would like to absent myself from this conversation.
Acknowledged. Thank you, Councillor Rowan. So that's in relation to item 6. And Councillor Barnett-Ward.
Thank you, Chair. I'm declaring a pecuniary interest in item 6. I'm CEO of Reading Association for the Blind, which is in receipt of Narrowing the Gap funding and would be applying for any future round of similar funding. So I'll be removing myself from the meeting for that item.
Thank you, Councillor Barnett-Ward. Anything on the other side? Okay. We can tell which side is the party of community engagement. On then to the minutes of the previous meeting. Anything on those? No, I'll sign them. Are we all right to agree them? Good, thank you. And petitions and questions. So we do have a petition tonight, and it will be presented to us by Catherine McCann. So if you come up, Catherine, and take the microphone there, and you will have up to 3 minutes to introduce the petition.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can, yes.
Great,
thank you.
Thank you. So during the pandemic, Reading's parks have become even more popular, and now play equipment is available for use again. A lot of people have been using the play area on the Wokingham Road side of Palmer Park, and the lack of toilet facilities has become a problem. The current sports centre toilets can be used, but they're too far away. The toilets in the new sports facilities also won't be ideally located. The toilets in Tutu's Ethiopian table are really intended for customers, and having other people coming and going to use the facilities is not ideal, especially during the pandemic, given the small size of the building. There is another building nearby, which used to be open as a toilet block, is now sitting derelict, but restoring and reopening it would be an ideal solution. Being right next to the play area, it would be well used. This toilet block, along with the Park Keepers Lodge and Pavilion, were designed by nationally recognised local architect William Ravenscroft. An application has been submitted for them to be locally listed. A petition to reopen the toilet block and locally list these buildings has now been signed by 269 people. I submitted it electronically last week and will send over the additional signatures after this meeting. I urge the council to investigate restoring and reopening the toilet block and consider the application to locally list the 3 buildings. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms McCann, and I have Councillor Rowland to respond.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank Ms McCann for presenting the petition and for her question. The old toilet facility in Palmer Park has been shut for over 25 years. The age of the building means the scope for the modern requirements of accessibility for all is very limited. Fully functioning and accessible toilet facilities have been and will continue to be provided nearby throughout the build of the new Palmer Park Sports Center, which has longer opening hours than the council's other public toilets. What we are providing meets present-day public facilities requirements, and therefore we are not considering reopening the facility that you're inquiring about at this time, as it would be very expensive, likely involve extensive redevelopment, and require managing for its intended use. Instead, we are focusing our limited budgets on reopening public toilet facilities across the borough closed during the pandemic and which do not have alternative conveniences nearby, unlike Palmer Park. Notably, the Palmer Park Sports Center will have fully accessible modern toilets and essential changing places facilities when it opens in late 2022. This was extremely important to the council to ensure accessibility for all with our new state-of-the-art facilities. Furthermore, in recognizing the importance of providing public toilets, we have recently removed charging mechanisms which were prone to vandalism to make them more accessible and available to the public. The council is in the process of reviewing a range of future options on the Palmer Park toilet block. The toilet block has been subjected to antisocial behavior in the past, and with a constrained budget, we must be mindful of the ongoing maintenance cost of any number of the arguably charming and attractive Victorian buildings and monuments that dot the council's estate, as the answers to maximize their uses can often be very complex and expensive. That being said, I can assure you that the council has never flagged in its commitment to the retention of the old toilet block and its associated buildings. As such, the council will consider this petition that represents the feelings of residents as part of the process in determining its future use. Palmer Park Pavilion, including all buildings referenced in this petition, was nominated for addition to the list of locally important buildings, or the local list, on the 23rd of September 2020. The council has recently put in place a new process for adding buildings to the local list, which means that decisions are made by the Planning Applications Committee, which I also sit on. Consideration of this nomination was delayed whilst the new process was put in place. The process is now up and running, with committee on December 1st making the first additions to the list under this new process. Consultations on adding Palmer Park Pavilion to the local list were sent out to the relevant consultees and stakeholders as specified in the process, those being landowners, ward councillors, the Reading Conservation Area Advisory Committee, and the Reading Civic Society on the 7th of October 2021. In my capacity as lead member for Heritage, I was also advised on this process. The consultation period is now closed, and a decision on whether to add the building to the local list will be made at a forthcoming meeting of the Planning Applications Committee. I can certainly understand and appreciate the public's affinity for the charming and attractive Victorian buildings within Palmer Park that this petition speaks to, but I would also like to place a bit of context to the conundrum we face in dealing with some of these quaint Victorian public facilities. I cite an advert from the 7th of September 1900 for a park keeper and constable for Palmer Park, which included the maintenance of these buildings. In that advert, the man, and it was definitely a man, that was to accept the keeper constable's role was also expected to have a wife that would be specifically required to attend to the ladies' lavatory. I am sure, as such, you would agree that times have moved on substantially from when the block was built, and the demands of a constable and wife is clearly no longer in keeping with responsible council budgeting, nor achieving the requirements for public accessibility. However, as a final reassurance, in my role also as Reading's Heritage Champion, I look forward to continuing innovative conversations with officers and the community to find a fitting answer to utilize the building in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Rowland. Of course, Councillor Page remembers the shortlisting for the constable position, but that's so that takes us to the end of that item. But thank you again for bringing the petition, and of course we'll receive any updates that you submit as well. Thank you, Ms. McCann. Moves us on then to councillor questions, because we have no public questions this evening. So our first councillor question is Councillor White to the lead councillor for education, Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair. This is on school meals, good, bad or ugly. When I was at school, I was the type of child who enjoyed school meals. Green councillors think the government should fund all children getting a delicious free school meal to make Reading fairer. Brighter Futures has a contract with a new school meals provider following the previous one ending. I know a number of children who don't like the new school meals. I also know that meals have been tweaked in response to some of the negative feedback. Please can I get an update on the percentage of children and young people who were eating school meals for each month since the new contract started? Can I also get the same information for each month in 2019 before COVID for comparison? Also, what areas for improvement has Brighter Futures identified?
Thank you, Councillor White. Councillor Pearce.
Thank you, Chair. The school meals contract was recently awarded to Caterlink and commenced on the 1st of August 2021. The initial term is until 31st of July 2024, with the option to then extend in periods of no less than 12 months. The primary meal price was finalised at £2.10, which is 10p less than the previous contract. Caterlink will be delivering meals that meet the silver standard of the Food for Life Served Here catering mark. The previous contract met the bronze standard. All staff will be paid in line with the National Living Wage Foundation living wage rates. As well as this, Caterlink offered a range of added value and community engagement initiatives as part of their tender, and these will now form part of the contract and performance review as part of an ongoing contract management. There's also a requirement in the contract for Caterlink to employ a minimum of 1 apprentice and 1 work experience placement per year from the council area. Unlike Councillor White, unless I'm mistaken, I'm someone that spends every working day in a school and has done so for the past 15 years. I can vouch from my own experience that the quality of school meals has improved significantly over this time. Rather than knowing a number of children who don't like the new school meals and the unsubstantiated negative feedback, my feedback and experience of school meals is the opposite. Below is the summary total percentage meal uptake for September to November 2021, along with a comparison to the same period in 2019. September 2019 was chosen as the comparators at the start of the academic year and wasn't interrupted by the pandemic. As you can see the table there. There's been progress since the start of term, with 3% increase in overall meal uptake from September to November 21. Although the levels of uptake are reduced from pre-pandemic comparison, this is to be expected given that schools and pupils are adjusting to a full menu and not eating in the classroom. There was also a late or staggered start for many schools and continued higher than average levels of absence due to COVID. Other local authorities have had similar experiences. Universal free school meals were, of course, a Labour Party manifesto policy at the last election, but as my party did not win, this is unfortunately not something we can enact. Maybe Councillor White could lobby the Conservative government, including Reading West MP Alok Sharma, to take up this Labour Party policy. A filling and nutritional meal is a vital part of a young person's day that helps ensure their focus is on learning, and we're pleased so many young people take up the offer of school meals and I hope more choose to do so in the future. We're also very pleased that the recent contract award is better value for money, of a higher quality, and that sees staff rewarded with a wage they can live on.
Thank you, Councillor Pearce. Councillor White, did you have a supplementary?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Pearce, for the response. Just to come back on that last bit of my question about any areas for improvement that Brighter Futures has identified. It could all be going swimmingly, and I hear what you said, but yeah, interested in what your thoughts are.
Councillor Pearce.
Thank you. So obviously, as it's such an early contract, I think the point is in the briefing that I know you were party to. Schools will also be actively encouraged to provide feedback to allow outcomes to be measured. So as part of the KPIs, we'll be seeing what schools say needs to be improved before we make any action.
Thank you, Councillor Pearce. So on then to Councillor question 2, which is also Councillor White, this time to lead Councillor for Strategic Environment Planning and Transport. Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair. This is on diesel fumes at children's play areas. Does the lead councillor agree that running diesel engines close to children's play areas is damaging to their health and to the wider environment? Ice cream vans have been part of British history for decades and a welcome sight and sound on a hot day. Will the council do everything it can to support a change from diesel vehicles to electric, including consulting Reading's vendors and installing electric vehicle charging points at pitches such as Palmer Park and across Reading?
Councillor Page.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank Councillor White for his question. It is well known and referenced extensively in our draft local transport plan and air quality action plans that emissions from diesel and petrol engine vehicles are harmful to health. As reported to policy and SEPT committees, it is the intention of the council to phase out the use of diesel and petrol vehicles where feasible from our council-owned or licensed vehicles, and to replace them with cleaner alternatives such as electric-powered vehicles. This phasing out requires both policy changes and consultation, as well as the development and provision of appropriate infrastructure. Due to the financial impact of the pandemic on all street traders, any proposals would need to be sensitive to the cost of vehicle replacements, especially in the absence of any central government grants. Officers across the relevant council departments will be bringing forward further proposals next year.
Thank you, Councillor Page. Councillor White, did you have a supplementary?
Yeah, just a quick one. Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Councillor Page. Next year's quite a long time. Could you narrow down that statement?
Councillor Page?
When it's ready, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Page. Moves us on then to question 3. Again, Councillor White, this time to myself. Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair. This is on tackling climate change through fossil fuel divestment. Green councillors share the concerns of many residents and council employees that we must ensure that our council pensions are not funding climate disaster. In 2015, the council stated that Berkshire Pension Fund had £27 million invested indirectly in fossil fuels. Please can I get an updated figure for Berkshire Pension Fund's direct and indirect investments in fossil fuel companies? Please can the leader of the council also update me on the pension fund's progress towards being fully divested, both directly and indirectly, from fossil fuels?
I thank Councillor White for the question, and perhaps I can start again by explaining the structure of local government pension funds, which provides important context for my answers. Reading Borough Council does not manage the pension fund. This is administered by the Berkshire Pension Fund, for which the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, RBWM, acts as the administering authority on behalf of all the local authorities in Berkshire. The Berkshire Pension Fund's environmental, social and governance statement summarises its approach to the management of environmental risks, including climate change. Section 5 of the fund's investment strategy statement also sets out how RBWM is mindful of the need to protect its reputation as an institutional investor by taking account of environmental considerations. The statement goes on to explain that RBWM will not place social, environmental or corporate governance restrictions on the investment manager, but relies on it to adhere to best practices in the jurisdictions in which they are based, operate and invests. The investment manager referred to is an organisation called Local Pensions Partnership, which manages investments for a number of local government pension funds, including the Berkshire scheme. LPP has a responsible investment policy, which includes a specific annex on climate change, both of which can be viewed here. These set out how LPP uses a target-based approach to ensure that and I quote, ensure that it invests in companies which are addressing and assisting the transition to a lower carbon future and moving out of those which are not managing risk effectively on behalf of shareholders. In other words, the process of divestment. It also sets out how LPP is actively divesting specifically from companies engaged in thermal coal extraction. Reading Borough Council adopted a policy supporting the principle of divestment in fossil fuels as long ago as 2015, and we apply this to all investments within our direct control. While pension fund investment decisions are not within our direct control, as explained above, we have made our position clear to the relevant authorities. For example, in March 21, we forwarded correspondence with a concerned resident to the Berkshire Pension Fund as a reminder of the Council's position. The Berkshire Pension Fund Committee, at its meeting on the 22nd of March 2021, agreed a comprehensive responsible investment policy. which is available on their website. And I'm advised that the fund has one of the lowest levels of investment in fossil fuels among all local authority pension funds. LPPI has embraced a commitment to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, although I personally would like the Berkshire Pension Fund to establish a shorter timescale in its capacity as asset owner. I'm pleased that when the matter was discussed at the committee last week, there was an undertaking to establish a cross-party task and finish group to consider the fund's asset owner commitments. I was left under the impression that the exact terms of the group are still to be agreed, but I doubt that advisory participants, such as myself, will be able to participate. Nonetheless, I was pleased that there were other full members of the committee who were of a similar mind. I trust this provides some assurance that while divestment is a complex process rather than a single event, I am very mindful of the role which investments can play in tackling climate change, and the policies referred to above should be taking the pension fund in the right direction, even if I must temper my own impatience in pursuit of collective agreement to further commitments. I will, however, forward your question and this answer to the Berkshire Pension Fund as a further reminder of the Council's position and to underline our concern to see rapid progress in this area. At the time of drafting this response, we have yet to have had confirmation from RBWM as to the current investment levels in fossil fuels, but once such information is received, officers will ensure that it is disseminated. As I've said previously, I would encourage all interested parties to make direct representation to RBWM and to the pension fund. It's a source of some frustration to me personally that this request is so rarely taken up, because we all know that a multitude of voices speak louder than a single one. That's not a targeted attack, I should stress when I read it. I feel it reads like that, but the point is a general one, which is I often encourage people to write with their concerns to RBWM and to the pension fund, but it's very rare that they actually do. Councillor White, did you have a supplementary?
Thank you, Councillor Brock. I was disappointed that it wasn't a targeted personal attack. You sort of missed a trick there, but I reassure you that I have been emailing them as well, along with other residents. No follow-up question. I look forward to receiving a response from the officer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor White. Councillor McElroy?
Yeah, thank you. I had two questions of clarification. One might be a bit harder, one might be a bit easier, and I'm happy to take them on notice and follow up. In here you say that the fund has one of the lowest levels of investment in fossil fuels among all local authority pension funds, and I'm wondering if you have any comparisons to other non-local authority pension funds and whether it performs well there, if that's a reasonable comparison that can even be made. My second question, which I think might be the simpler one, is do we have any control over who administers our who is the administering authority, or are we basically stuck with the Royal Borough of Windsor and Maidenhead, or are we able to shop around, if you see where I'm going with that? Cheers, thank you.
Sure. So on the first one, you'll be disappointed, I'm sure, to know that I don't possess a comprehensive knowledge of all pension fund investments across the UK. I'm sure that we could get that information, but this is a good example of the sort of question where if you ask me, you're asking someone who then has to ask RBWM, who then has to ask the asset manager. And it would perhaps be better to go direct to RBWM with these kind of queries, because I think it's helpful when people do. But I appreciate the question. I think it's something that you should follow up. In terms of the management of the fund, that was something that was established at the point of unitarisation of Berkshire. And so the Royal Borough acts as the accountable body administering the fund. I'm not entirely sure, but the monitoring officer may be able to clarify to me what but we would never separate out our pension fund independent of Berkshire, because it would lack that mass that is required to have a sustainable pension fund. And of course, many of the liabilities it has relate to people who previously worked for the county when it was established as a council. So, you know, there could be discussions perhaps in the future at an appropriate time around how some of the governance structures work, but I don't think about the fact that RBWM is the accountable body. Does that sound, you look like you're on the edge of your seat, Deputy Chief Exec?
Sorry, Leader. Just to clarify, the council doesn't have the ability to come out of the RBWM scheme. That is set up in legislation for all local authorities. There is an administering body that is designated in two-tier areas. It's obviously the county council for that area, and the districts are required to use that arrangement. As the leader said, when unitarisation came to Berkshire, RBWM was designated as the authority to undertake that, but there isn't an ability to come out of that arrangement.
I would say it's genuinely one of the more interesting committees I have found myself forced onto in recent, but that's just me. Rightio, that's the end of councillor questions. So item 5 would be decision books, but we haven't had any call-ins. So on to item 6. So Councillor Rowland, Councillor Barnett-Ward will be leaving us. And as they remove themselves, I'll just pause briefly. For the purposes of the recorded record, there was a crisis at the door. Right, so I'll ask the officers to introduce in a moment, but one thing I will say that in response to the sort of conditions that have become apparent as the pandemic has taken its course over this winter and some feedback we've had in relation to that, we will be suggesting an amendment to the recommended action today, but I'll come back to that after we've had the officer introduction. So 2 officers have appeared. Am I going to Melissa first? I'm going to Lara first. Over to Lara.
Thank you, Chair.
You're going to me first, yes? Okay,
yes.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just by way of introduction, my name is Lara Flemings. I'm the Head of Commissioning with DAX. So the Narrowing the Gap framework that we currently have in place ends on the 31st of May 2022. That framework allocates 1.13 million to 27 providers, and the focus of that framework is on poverty, discrimination, promotion of well-being. In anticipation of the end of that framework, then we have, as officers, been working on the next steps in terms of the need to re-procure a framework of support. So one of the initial pieces of work that has been done around this is a needs assessment. So that looking at sort of the overall kind of needs within the borough, and what we're seeing from that is increasing levels of deprivation experienced by some people and some groups, and we think it's probably no surprise at all to see how the pandemic has exacerbated some of those differences as well, with poorer health and more limited access to opportunities experienced by some people. I think that can be seen on both a place-based perspective. For example, with higher deprivation in certain areas of the town, we now have 5 sort of lower super output areas, so where there's greater levels of deprivation, which is an increase on the position in 2018 when there were 2 in those highest 10% highest areas of deprivation. And also from an equalities-based perspective, with greater impact on, for example, some Black and minority ethnic groups, people with disabilities, older people, and also younger people. So quite a wide-ranging impact that we're seeing in terms of the level of need. The Narrowing the Gap framework, as it is at the moment, and thinking about re-procuring, we can identify that it's a major focus of the council and CCG policies as well. So within Berkshire West Health and Wellbeing Strategy, the corporate plan, all of this is about actually how we address these areas of deprivation and how Narrowing the Gap and the VCS sector procurement can impact on that. I think within all of those policies and strategies, you can see an intention to support people to have an equal chance to thrive, and to reduce those differences that in well-being that are experienced by different people in different groups. But also, I think within that, building on individual strengths and the assets of the community as well, so in enabling that to happen. And the VCS plays a very critical part in that process. It is very much about us strengthening and building on the town and the people, and sort of enabling people to have greater independence and use their own strengths, and an empowering role. In recognising the importance of the VCS, over the last few months, the Council has also carried out a VCS review, which has involved bringing in a consultant who's worked with a number of, spoken to many of the VCS organisations, as well as to some of yourselves as members and to some of the officers as well, looking at how we can move forward with our a more empowering, trusting relationship with the VCS, recognising their expertise, recognising sort of the knowledge on the ground, the grassroots grassroots knowledge, and building on that. And that information that's come out of the VCS review is very much kind of influenced our proposals around the next phase for what is currently narrowing the gap. In building on that, as well as the VCS review, we've also had substantial number of engagement sessions with the sector themselves. So that's included sort of briefing sessions, keeping them up to date and up to speed with where we're going, as well as sort of much more kind of workshopy kind of approaches where we're looking at sort of how we might go about the next phase. So what does that mean, and where does that leave us, and what is the main content of the paper and the recommendations within that? We're recommending that we have a new VCS framework. The recommendation is that we move from narrowing the gap to a more aspirational closing the gap as our branding for that framework. We're recommending that we offer 3-year contracts. Although there is different views within the sector, I think the majority of VCS providers value that the certainty that comes with a contractual arrangement being in place. We're looking at sustaining the funding at 1.13 million. So the contributions from public health, adult social care, housing, also a contribution from the CCG and the council itself. And then the most significant element of that is actually moving to an outcome focused approach, where rather than the council specifying very clearly this is what we wish to get from the sector, actually, as I said before, recognising that knowledge and experience and inviting them to use that knowledge to submit their proposals as to how they address the outcomes and priorities that we have identified. Those outcomes, they are articulated within the paper, but if I say them here, this is around supporting people to get out and stay out of poverty, to build resilience, independence and well-being, connecting people to support and focusing on individual and community strengths, and investing in infrastructure support for the VCS. So as part of the bidding process, so we're anticipating, providers will be asked to submit proposals which answer the following questions. What's the change you believe needs to happen and why? How will you work to make this change happen? How do you know your activities will create change and that change is happening? And how will this work contribute to our priorities? The bids that are submitted will be evaluated against our outcomes framework, and after contract award, then we'll be looking to work very closely with the sector in achieving those outcomes. We'll be looking very strongly at how organisations collaborate both with each other as VCS organisations, and that builds on what's already in narrowing the gap, but also alongside the statutory partners with the council and the CCG. So the recommendations that are in the report are that we're recommending that we launch the new outcomes focused commissioning programme, the procurement of services, to meet the 3 outcomes. That the budget envelope is sustained at 1.13 million, with an element of this ring fenced around the carer services. The reason for that is because the carer services, the delivery of carers assessments is a statutory function of the council, so we need to have more clarity around the specification of that. The contracts will be awarded to the providers of submitted proposals deemed to have the most positive impact on outcomes, and also that the delegated authority to award the contracts after that process is given to the Deputy Chief Exec in consultation with the leader and the Executive Director of Adult Social Care and Health. So do you want to go on to the proposed changes? No?
No, I think that was perfectly comprehensive. I might need to get you to mute yourself because there's a horrible echo in the room. I assume, sorry, Melissa, Deputy Director, that you didn't have anything to add?
No,
okay.
Thanks.
Wonderful, thank you. In which case, I'll start with the more administrative business there. I mean, so understandably, the voluntary sector will find themselves in a very busy period over the coming few months, you know, with a kind of enhanced vaccination rollout in particular, and also just generally a difficult period. So What I'm proposing is that we amend recommended action 2.1 to read thus: that the Deputy Chief Executive, in consultation with the Leader of the Council, be granted delegated authority to A, consider the implications of the government's latest COVID guidance and recent feedback from Reading Voluntary Action on the reprocurement timetable and agree deadlines as appropriate, and B, subject to any revised timetabling, extend all current narrowing the gap contracts as required. So 2.3 would also need a minor amendment to remove the specific reference to the 1st of June 2022 as well. So the reason for that is it allows a bit more time and flexibility for us to engage with the sector, understand, when things are a little bit more stable, when they're better able to make applications, when we're better able to pursue this commissioning framework, and acknowledging that that may require a little bit of flexibility on our part as well. It would allow us to extend the current narrowing the gap contracts so that there's no gap in provision. So hopefully everybody's all right with that. And I suppose since I formally moved that, I should ask someone to second it at some point. Councillor Terry.
Yeah, I'll second to reserve my right.
Thank you, Councillor Terry. So the other things I had to say, so moving on from that specific administrative point, is I think it's actually a really wonderful thing that we've got to this place. I mean, the voluntary sector understandably has desired to move to an outcomes-based approach. I think it's good that we find ourselves able to facilitate that. I think it's in our interest as a council. I think it's in residents' interests across the town as well. Clearly, in a world where much has been reshaped or at least changed by the impact of the pandemic, it's also appropriate that we would seek to work out what is the right work to commission around Reading. So I think it's very important that we undertake this piece of work and that we undertake it properly and that we ensure that the sector comes with us on that journey. You'll note that we've dropped the language at the moment of narrowing the gap, which was kind of my suggestion. Not that I have any aversion to the terminology, but because I thought, if we're changing for something very fundamental about the approach towards something much more based on outcomes, it seems right that we might think about with the VCS whether it's appropriate to rename that framework. I mean, I'd suggested closing the gap, if not only because narrowing the gap seems slightly unambitious. You might want to close it rather than just make it slightly smaller, right? Sorry? Removing the gap is exactly the same terminology as closing the gap. You've just picked up a thesaurus there, Councillor White. So that's all I have to say at the moment, but I really welcome the report. I think it's obviously a shame that we might have to delay the procurement timetable, but it's right and proper that we do that. Important to get it right, important that the VCS have the capacity to properly engage with it when they may otherwise at the present moment be distracted by other very important work. So there we are. I open to the floor, but I've not had any indications. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. You'll be delighted to learn that we will be backing this recommended action this evening. I'd like to also thank the officers for preparing the report and for all the hard work and effort behind the developing of the framework. We too, when we were discussing this, had strong concerns over the timelines, especially when it's stated that the launch of the bidding process is in just 4 days' time to start. So we certainly thank you for the flexibility in terms of providing a greater time for those organisations wishing to bid to actually put forward their bids in sufficient time. Because clearly at this time of year, many organisations are winding down for Christmas and such like, and obviously testing times we live in. There are other things, I think, on people's agendas at present, but thank you for that. But yes, again, we will be backing the recommended action. Thank you, Chair.
Wonderful. Councillor Melroy.
Yeah, thank you. I've been speaking with the officers in the background via email on this, and it's no secret that I really like where this is going. The outcomes and evidence-based approach is exactly the sort of thing that I think we'd like to see. So we'll be supporting this. And as I said via email, just so I'm saying it to the room as well, I think my only concern about this sort of thing is that Moving to an outcomes and an evidence-based approach is something that's easy to say, but quite difficult to actually evaluate in practice. And it would be a real shame to get to the end of these projects and not be able to say conclusively that they succeeded. And I worry that sometimes some of these small, volunteer organisations, asking them to create something that would be able to do that evaluation is quite a technical skill. So my suggestion to the team, which I know they've taken on board and notice, is that to build into the application process something that encourages the applicant to spend an appropriate amount of the grant on evaluation with these things. There's often a desire to spend as much as possible on action rather than evaluation, and just to make sure that that's recognised and we really have something great to sing about at the end of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Melroy. I mean, it's worth adding to that one of the reasons we've always emphasised having funding for infrastructure in the sector is exactly so that there is the support for some of the smaller organisations around that kind of work. You rightly point out, evaluative work is a technical kind of endeavour, and it's right therefore that we make funding available so that there is this infrastructure in the VCS in Reading so that they can support the smaller organisations in that kind of, just as they support them with the process of bidding and so on and so forth as well. So I think we're well covered in that regard, but the comments are noted. Was there anything officers felt they needed to come back on? Otherwise, I'll move to the vote. No? Wonderful. Anything else? No? Good. Well, then are we okay to approve the amended recommended action then? Okay. Unanimous. Wonderful. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you to Melissa and Lara for joining us. Moving us on then to item 7. Which is the award of, oh, we better get the guys back in, hadn't we? Gosh, where have they gone to? Are they? Would have made this item shorter if we hadn't got Councillor Rowland back, of course. But you don't have to, it's on the recording. Right, okay, we've got Councillor Rowland and Councillor Barnett-Ward back, and thank you, Councillor Mpufu-Coles, for finding them. That moves us on to item 7, the award of contract for the Hexagon Pantomime Production Service. Now, before I go to the officer introduction, we do have a commercially confidential appendix on this item. I would propose, you'll have all read it and absorbed all of the information. If you had questions in relation to it, please do indicate now, because we will enter the closed session, deal with those, come back to the public session. So did anybody have questions in relation to the commercially confidential appendix? Wonderful, that makes life easier, brilliant. So over then to Sarah Cox, who I think is introducing this report.
Hi, my name's Sarah Cox. I'm General Manager of the Hexagon, and I am here to present the proposal to recommend the award of the Hexagon Pantomime contract from 2022 onwards. We're currently in our final year of the current contract for the pantomime. It's by far the most important thing we do at the Hexagon. It's our biggest sort of income delivery, and it's our biggest attendance with over 35,000 people attending a year to the pantomime. So it's a very important contract for us to get the right producer in place. The recommendation is to award the contract to bidder A. We went through a procurement process earlier in the year to procure into the next contract from next year onwards. Bidder A by far is the most experienced producer and also has a track record in producing pantomimes in similar sized venues to large audiences similar to the Hexagon. So that's the recommendation. We're procuring and entering the contract now a year in advance of the contract because we have to have sort of a year's lead up to sell the panto and to get things like ticket prices, confirm that kind of information. So we're looking a year in advance at getting the contract in place for that reason. So yeah, in summary, we'd like to get the recommendation to approve the award of the contract to bidder A for the Hexagon pantomime for 2022 onwards.
Thank you, Ms. Cox, and I have Councillor Rowland.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank Sarah Cox and officers for bringing this forward. This is really a good news situation here in the middle of the uncertain times that we're certainly facing, and the challenges we have to maintain a positive flow with our entertainment venues, and especially with the Hexagon, are very present and very real. So I would just like to thank officers for being able to land this and would heartily recommend it to colleagues. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Rowland. Councillor White.
Thank you, Chair. We will be supporting this, but with Councillor Page's flair for acting, I was very disappointed not to see a bid going in from the Labour group. He's put in a number of stellar performances recently, but I do have one question for officers, though, which is, can they confirm that people working on this contract will be paid at least a living wage?
Thank you, Councillor White. Any other comments? I'll go back to Sarah Cox. I mean, it would be required in our procurement framework, so I assume it to be the case.
In terms of the staffing, in terms of the Reading Borough Council, the Hexagon side of stuff, we would be paying the contract as per Reading Borough Council rates of pay for staff involved in the show. We'll need to confirm with the potential bidder their rates of pay. If that's a question we're required to ask them, I'd need to get that confirmed.
Yeah, I mean, that is a standard part of our procurement framework, so I would imagine and hope it to be the case, but you can let us know if it's not, would be helpful, but I have no reason to believe that it's not, and there's nothing in the commercially confidential appendix that suggests otherwise either. So we're okay to proceed? Wonderful, agreed? You should ask Councillor Page. I take it that was unanimous, by the way. I didn't see anybody dissent. You should ask Councillor Page about his turns as a pantomime dame when you have another opportunity. Moves us on then, and thank you, Ms. Cox. Moves us on then to item 8, which is the Q2 performance and monitoring report, and we have Darren Carter to present.
Good evening. This report sets out the Council's financial position as at the end of September 2021. The projected overspend on services has increased from £7 million at Q1 to £8.1 million at Q2. This includes a structural overspend of £4 million, £4.2 million on DACs, and an overspend of £3.5 million on DENS that includes £4.4 million of additional costs that are attributable to COVID-19. It is proposed to fund this £8.1 million overspend on services through the use of the COVID-19 support grant that is available but was previously unallocated. It is also proposed to utilise £3.8 million of corporate contingencies and to use £1.8 million of the £2.7 million of earmarked reserves that was approved for use in the 2021-22 budget. The use of this combination of contingencies and one-off resources means that a break-even position is now projected for this year. Policy Committee is requested to approve this approach. This year's budget includes £20.2 million worth of savings proposals. £12.3 million of these are on track to be delivered by the end of this financial year, which is more than 60% of the savings targets. £4.7 million of savings are now categorised as red and are now assessed as being non-deliverable. The housing revenue account is projected to underspend by £874k this year, which will reduce the planned call on HRA reserves. Finally, the capital programme is forecast to underspend by £40 million, with spend being reprofiled to now take place in future years. It's also recommended that the Open Spaces Improvement Scheme referred to in section 9.2 is added to the capital programme. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Director of Finance. Firstly, I go to Councillor McEwen.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to officers for such an in-depth report. This report highlights the difficulties faced throughout the pandemic, particularly adult social care and economic growth and neighbourhood services. It is worth noting, on a positive note, that children's services are still delivering on budget despite the challenges faced. Nonetheless, none of the problems highlighted in the report will be just as challenging next year and possibly the year after due to uncertainties caused by the COVID pandemic. So it is very important that we set our budgets accordingly, but it is reassuring that we will be able to finish the year in a break-even position. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor McEwen. I think it's testament to the approach the council has taken over the past few years to ensure that we do have adequate contingencies and reserves that allow us to weather difficult periods as we're currently experiencing. I think it's kind of worth speaking just a little bit, because Councillor Stevens mentioned it last time, I think, about the capital programme underspend and sort of the size of it. I think it's important as part of the budgeting process as we move forward to ensure that we're realistic about when we expect capital spend to occur. And understandably, there's been a great deal of disruption this year, but we can't assume that it will all simply happen, therefore, next year, because council capacity is finite. So there will have to be a comprehensive programme of review, I think, around the capital programme and when that spending will happen, when those projects will move forward. I have nothing from colleague or Councillor Stevens.
Just identifying savings, which I appreciate each year becomes harder and harder, and we're saying obviously it was at 4.7 were identified and now non-deliverables red. I suppose it's a plea come thought, which is to be very realistic about what is achievable in terms of savings. Because I can see officers, managers are under pressure to find savings. They'll declare something is a saving or could be a saving when really it's not going to be, and that just piles pressure on towards as the year progresses that actually it's not realisable. So it's not to say there's an answer to that, but it's just a recognition of the problem.
No, I think it's. I mean, on balance, I mean, given the disruption of the past couple of years, I think that the savings delivery has been very impressive. I think you're absolutely. I mean, one of the issues that has occurred is that some of the transformation or the work behind those savings has been delivered, but they no longer deliver the saving that was envisaged because the world around us has changed. And it's particularly an issue in some areas of adult social care, but also with some of the income generation proposals within the DENS Directorate, where, of course, it's no longer possible to generate the income even if you do the underlying work to enable you in theory to realise it. So hopefully that some may still yield dividends in the future, or they will yield cost avoidance. But it's a good point to make. Now, no other comments. So I assume. Sorry. Oh, Chief Executive.
Presuming you can hear me, I think just on the savings, where I feel a bit defensive, what I would point out is a number of the savings proposals which are in the system are income related, and obviously COVID has had a big impact on our ability to do some of the commercial projects and income generating projects which we'd hoped. Without giving any secrets away or the report that's coming next, I would also feel fair to point out to members that the report the management team has had on the next month, the month 7, shows a better position than this report, particularly around the allocation of some particular COVID grants to some of our expenditure, and some of the trends and projections have got a little bit better as we're heading towards doing the budget for next year, which probably means, touch wood, that some of the use of the reserves which was budgeted may not be necessary. The last thing I'd say on the savings is when members set the budget in February, they set the contingency figure deliberately knowing that there was risk in the savings. So each of the savings had a risk profile and a contingency against them. And I think if at the end of the year we get through this year and only use the contingency that was set against those savings in light of the headwinds from the pandemic, that would be a considerable achievement of the managers in the service.
Thank you, Chief Executive. I can't imagine there will be all that many top-tier councils reporting a break-even position at the end of the year. So I think we should be pleased about where we're at the moment. Director, was there anything you needed to come back on?
No.
No, thank you very much. In which case, I move the recommended action. Are we all able to agree? Wonderful, unanimous. Thank you very much. And that moves us on then to item 9, which is the MTFS update. Back over to Darren Carter.
Thank you. So this report provides an update to the Council's medium-term financial strategy that was approved back in February. This update reflects the changing landscape and uncertainties as we approach the end of the second year of the pandemic. There still remains considerable uncertainty about future council funding. The autumn statement appeared to indicate that we would be getting a 3-year funding settlement, including 3% real terms growth in our core spending power. But the latest rumours I've heard this week are that we're now likely to only get a 1-year funding settlement figure when the provisional settlement is announced later this week. I will, of course, provide an update in due course about the outcome of that provisional settlement. COVID-19 has also had a big impact on income levels, which still haven't returned to pre-COVID levels. We're also seeing big pressures in adult social care, with this update assuming a £5 million increase in the budget for adult social care for next year. And we're also still in negotiations with Brighter Futures about the contract sum for next year. This update assumes an increase of £1.1 million in the contract sum, but that is still being negotiated with Brighter Futures. But there's also some good news, as we are now assuming that the business rates reset that we had assumed would happen in 22-23 will not now happen until 23-24 at the earliest. We're also assuming that the 1.25% uplift in employers' national insurance will be fully funded by central government. We've also reviewed all of the savings that were previously assumed in the MTFS for 22-23. This, of course, follows on from the previous conversation about the Q2 report. And as a result, we've actually reduced the assumed levels of savings in 22-23 from the previous figure of £9 million to a new figure of £6.8 million in this update. So I do want to assure members that we've tried to be extremely realistic about the level of savings that are deliverable next financial year. The overall impact of all of these changes is a projected budget gap for next year of £3.3 million. Now, this will, of course, need to be addressed before the next report to Policy Committee in February, as we are obliged legally to set a balanced budget. The next update to Policy Committee will also include any growth above that needed to fund the national insurance increase that is announced as part of the provisional settlement, which will hopefully be later this week. Any additional growth in the council tax base following the report to council at the end of January, and the confirmation from central government of the actual level of business rate reliefs that we will be receiving for next financial year. We've made a prudent assessment of each of those 3 items in this version of the MTFS, but there is scope for our funding against all 3 items to improve by the time we get to the next report. In the later years of the MTFS, we've also made an assessment of the potential impact of the adult social care reforms, which we currently assume to be cost neutral, and also of the impact of the Environment Bill, which at the moment we don't assume to be cost neutral. We're assuming it will have a negative impact on the council finances. But both of those will continue to be reviewed as we go along and updated when more information is available. Policy Committee is asked to note the contents of this updated MTFS, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Director. Now, I always find this process to be helpful of having an update or a draft budget. I think it provides a kind of internal deadline for getting a clear understanding of where we're at, and I find it helpful in terms of planning. Clearly, still a lot of work to be done before we have the full and final budget before us in February. It's also, I mean, it's a shame that every year we have to have these updates before we've had the local government finance settlement from government. It does make financial planning much more difficult than it needs to be. And of course, we're still expecting single year settlements when what we've needed for the past several years is, of course, a multi-year settlement to give us some sense of stability and of direction. As you can see, I mean, let's be transparent, there's still a sizable gap remaining across the 3 years of the new MTFS. The challenges that we've already discussed this evening remain unabated, but we will close that gap, and we will in February bring forward a balanced budget, because this isn't Liverpool and we're not militant. But if you look around the directorates, you can see, I think, you know, some of the shape of challenges to come. I mean, in adult social care, those pressures of care remain very acute, and especially as the NHS continues with medically optimised discharge, which places increasing difficulties upon our social care teams. But of course, you know, we step up to the plate on that, and we recognise that there's still more work to be done to ensure independent living is embraced as a principle in the work that we do. In the DENS Directorate, we know that income generation opportunities have become more difficult to come by. Economic recovery is what it is, but there's the retention of our key investments around leisure, housing, roads, and of course, throughout the pandemic and indeed in the future, we keep those essential services going, making sure that residents are not waiting for their recycling to be collected and waiting for their black bin to be collected. Brighter futures, ongoing pressures again, but a lot of innovation there, greater attention, of course, to costs, and it is good, as Councillor McEwen has already pointed out this evening, that they continue to report an expectation of a balanced position at the end of the year. And in the Resources Directorate, who are, you know, background workers quite often, but nonetheless have been incredibly important throughout the pandemic period, ensuring that we got grants out of the door to businesses and so on and so forth. And they will continue to grapple with the challenges around some of our wholly owned companies and some of the risks that those companies present and how they must be managed and mitigated moving forward. So a good piece of work, and I'm very grateful to Darren and his team for bringing it forward, very grateful to the corporate management team for their work around this, and I look forward to all of the further discussions we'll be having in the coming months to bring forward a full and complete budget in February. I'm sure we'll all look forward to that full council debate, as we always do. Did I have any comments from colleagues around the room? No? Are we okay to note the recommended action then? Agreed. Wonderful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Director. Moves us on to item 10, I hope. There I am, yes. Brighter Futures for Children's annual performance report. So I have Kate Grayford to present.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everybody. So this is a report that's coming to Policy Committee in its role as sole member for Brighter Futures for Children. So ever since the company was set up in October 2018, there are always two reports that come back to policy. One is the annual business plan, and this one is in relation to the retrospective performance of the company for financial year 2020 to 2021, and so includes the accounts which have been fully audited and posted with Companies House. This report gives an opportunity through the report to also highlight some of the key achievements of the company over the last year. So firstly, I'm sure we'll all recognise that the year was challenging for everybody, not least with the COVID pandemic. The company was able to take a very proactive approach in terms of management of risk assessment and visits to children and young people, which has helped the overall management and risk containment from our looked after children numbers. And the company's also been very proactive in its role that it's undertaken with communications with schools through the pandemic. Finally, the council wanted to take the opportunity to publicly thank Brighter Futures for Children for all of its support, with acting on behalf of the council within challenging timelines to distribute grants to vulnerable families with food and fuel vouchers. There have been some changes to staff, obviously, through the year, which Policy Committee will be aware of, with the chair joining the company at the beginning of the financial year and becoming executive chair partway through the year. However, the performance generally from a service perspective has been positive and actually led to the company and the services coming out of intervention in February. From a financial perspective, the accounts, as I say, are fully audited. They're unqualified. They do indicate a small overspend of 111,000, but actually this was due to an adjustment that didn't go through before year end, and actually the company came inside the contract sum budget that it was set. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Director. I think we've spoken, we've referenced at least Brighter Futures a few times this evening. I think it was a very successful year for them, and coming out of intervention, something we're all tremendously pleased about and proud about the work that had gone in behind that. The only thing I would say is becoming concerned, I think, that with all of the discussion that we have nationally, that focus on children's services needs to be just as comprehensive and explored in just the same comprehensive way as that discussion that we are attempting to have anyway around adult social care, because those challenges again will not abate, and indeed there remains that concern that there could be some pent-up demand within the system caused by some of the dislocation that we've experienced and that schools have experienced over the past couple of years. But I know that Councillor Pearce wants to come in, so I should hand over to him.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. As Kate Grave said, it's obviously been another tough year for our schools and the Brighter Futures team. And to build on some of the stuff that Kate's already said about our successes, we delivered 14,000 free school meal vouchers, 15,000 hampers, and this was before the national system came in. We had our own one in Reading. Our education, health and care plan systems have improved, achieving 100% timelines of completion in several months. The team continued to plan for more send places in various school projects. And as already mentioned, the improvement in communications was hugely noticeable and commented on from heads across the pandemic, which was sort of a positive that came out of it. And then internally, the transformation work, which has obviously helped the company come in their accounts on budget, the transformation work continues, and there's a much greater, certainly in the education side, stability of staff and expertise in the senior, especially at those senior levels. So I'd like to say a big thank you to everyone that worked so hard on that in the Brighter Futures team.
Thank you, Councillor Pearce. Councillor Terry.
Thank you, Chair. I mean, clearly everybody has said what needs to be said, but it is clear that Brighter Futures is showing an improving picture. Some of the performance indicators are not where they need to be yet, but they're certainly very much improved. I think to go through COVID and to make sure that all of our children were risk assessed, and all of our children who were of concern to us and young people still continue to have face-to-face visits is something that is clear didn't happen in other areas, and is much to the credit of our staff that they maintain that level of contact. As been said, we've come out of intervention. We had a hugely successful send inspection where there was no letter before action. That is, not very common. Increasingly, Reading, I attend the South East Lead members network, and increasingly Reading's been seen as something that's really turned things around, is actually now starting to appear to be not a leader in the field yet, but one that people are watching and seeing that we're really turning things around. And to do that and stay within the contract sum, I think is very impressive. Now, we did give them some more money, and that's fair enough in terms of other services. On the same side, though, they have been delivering their savings too. The transformation work that Councillor Pearce has referred to has really been showing. It took a while, but it's showing its rewards now. I think the other thing to also note is that in 2018, when Brighter Futures took over, we had 282 children who were looked after by the local authority. The last report I saw was 243. That's a significant decrease in the number of children that are being looked after, and is a credit to the work that's been ongoing in order to reunite children and young people with their families, and also to make sure that the work's done at the very front end to make sure that we're making the right decisions for children and young people and their families, and not unnecessarily taking them into a system that thereafter can be quite difficult for everybody to manage and to move on from. So all of that's quite risky sometimes. We know what we've heard about other and what can happen when it goes wrong and everybody piles in and says, oh, this is all awful. So I think that we can trust that they are working very hard to make good decisions, to make sure that children don't unnecessarily have to come into care, and that they're getting the support they need. Having said that, I constantly say to the Leader of the Council, nonetheless, it's a demand-led service, and we cannot know when things may change and things will go wrong, and it doesn't take very much for a number of children to have to come into care for costs to go up, and that's just the nature of things. But I think that we can see that the journey of improvement has been significant and hard fought at times, I have to say, but certainly we hope that it continues to go from strength to strength. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Terry. Councillor Robinson.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, I'd like to echo exactly what Councillor Terry has said. I'd also like to thank the officers and directors of Brighter Futures for Children for all their hard work in putting this report together and presenting this tonight. Nationally, as we all know, children's services is an area which again has been in the spotlight recently, with the truly shocking and appalling case of young Arthur Labino Hughes, who, as a child of only 6 years old, was subjected to the most horrendous and horrific levels of violence, cruelty and torture before his untimely death at the very hands of those that should have protected, cared and loved him, his own father and stepmother. No one in their right mind would not have been deeply affected and sickened by the revelations that came to light as to the inhuman and evil actions of his so-called parents. The last 2 years have not been easy on all of us, with the various lockdowns and restrictions placed to reduce the spread of the coronavirus. With children, this has been an exceptionally difficult time, not only through their missing education, but in not seeing close friends or other family, clearly with detrimental effects on mental health, and in some rare cases, facing other dangers behind closed doors, with safeguarding a sometimes very difficult, if not impossible feat. Some of you may know that a few years back I had the great privilege to do some work with the NSPCC in helping them build their safeguarding content, as well as the platform for its delivery. So this subject is one that is very close to my heart. On safeguarding itself, I would remind you all and those listening in that this is not just the responsibility of a few organisations such as Children's Services, the emergency services or teachers and school staff, but we are all responsible as a society. We all have a part to play in looking after our children. A plumber called into a house to fix a leaking tap may see something that isn't quite right, or as a neighbour seeing a once happy child playing, becoming withdrawn, or maybe just a passerby that sees something out of the ordinary or hears something untoward. All of us have a responsibility to report anything we feel may be wrong, and it could mean the difference between a child living safely in a happy, healthy and fulfilling life, or the terrible and shocking alternative of being at risk of abuse and danger. As to the report before us this evening, I'd like to say it made very good reading for me. It was very positive in terms of the achievements made and the progress in all areas, such as the provision of free school meals during the pandemic, the virtual school initiative, the improvement in reducing the number of child placements for children in care, bringing better stability, the great results of the Child in Need project initiative, improvements in SEND, and the growth in partnerships and valued partnerships, to name a few. So I feel we are heading in the right direction, yet with an acknowledgement that there is still much to be done, so no time for sitting on laurels. I feel that the way Brighter Futures for Children has adapted and become more agile in the face of the pandemic, embracing technology for virtual working and the addressing of the challenges that this has raised is commendable. And we should acknowledge and applaud the team, their leadership, and the lead councillor Terry for their efforts and for the continued improvements being made. Given where we were just a few years back with the intervention that was applied, I think we can clearly see that great strides have been made and that continuous improvements are being made. So I am more than happy to agree the recommended action, to note this report and commend it to the committee. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Robinson. I think you're very right to remind us of that collective societal even duty to always be mindful of safeguarding and of our responsibilities in that respect. And I think it's always going to be the case, entirely understandably and quite rightly, that catastrophic failures in children's services, in social care services more generally, are going to be thrust into the spotlight and make us reflect on the risks and make us reflect on what went wrong and how we avoid things going wrong. I think it's also important that we find the time and the space to celebrate the successes of children's social care and of adult social care as well, but of children's social care in particular, because when children's services are delivered well, the positive effect they have on a child's life outstrips almost anything else that this council delivers. You know, the positive effect of a good intervention from children's services or well delivered children's services, whatever it may be, far outstrips the benefit of filling a pothole, for example. Important though those things sometimes seem, they pale in comparison to the life-sustaining and life-enriching work that goes on in our social care departments. So I'm grateful we had the opportunity to discuss in the way that we have this evening very maturely about things. I should go, Assistant Director, anything you feel you need to add before I go to the vote? Wonderful, thank you. Then can I move the recommended action? Agreed? Agreed. Wonderful, unanimous. Thank you very much. And moves us on to item 11. Also related to Brighter Futures, but some reserved matters. And I think I'm over to Mike Graham for this one.
Thank you, Chair. We're presenting a short report this evening in relation to an appointment which needs to be made to ensure that the Board of Brighter Futures can continue to operate within the articles. The interim executive director, has left, and there's now an arrangement to have a secondment from Darren Carter, our own Director of Finance, onto the board for a period of 6 months. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. No, I think it's a very reasonable, pragmatic position for us to take. I mean, I've discussed it with Darren Carter as well, and appreciate that he understands what will be required of the role. So I think it's a good solution for the problem before us, and I'm pleased in speaking with the chair of the board over at Brighter Futures that they're going to advert for the sort of permanent replacement very, very shortly as well. Do I have anything from colleagues? Councillor Stevens?
Just to make the only obvious point that obviously we've come through a pretty sort of traumatic period in our finances. We're now finally getting to a much more stable position. I would hate to say that Mr. Carter takes his eye off the ball of the main RBC finances over commits to what's happening here and we go backwards, and that would be an awful thing to happen. So providing there's no reduction in the commitments resources to our own finances, and that it's imperative that when 6 months is up he's back and committed to it. This is an interim arrangement and it shouldn't be allowed to go on any further.
Echoes my thoughts exactly. I mean, it's incredibly important that it's maintained at being a maximum of 0.2 as a time commitment, and it shouldn't allow it to creep. I know that that's something that the Deputy Chief Executive is very committed to, as well as you know, the direct line manager for the Director of Finance. And there is still a lot of work, of course, to be done in the finance team, a lot of change happening over time. And I know from the conversations I've had with Mr. Carter, he remains entirely committed to that. And so I'm reassured that it is the right decision, and the right decision for pragmatic reasons, and of course helps us with a period of when we're trying to negotiate the sort of contract sum with Brighter Futures moving forward and so on as well. There is a degree of synergy around these things that ultimately I think will be helpful and time saving. I'm okay then to move the recommended action and for us to endorse that. Agreed? Agreed. Wonderful. Unanimous. Thank you all. And that takes us to item 12. Appointment of directors to Reading Transport Limited. Back to Mr. Graham.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, another short report about appointment of directors to a council company, in this case Reading Transport Limited, and members will recall receiving a report earlier in the year talking about the governance and particularly the challenges around the company coming out of COVID and the need to secure ridership and sustainability. That exercise has now been completed with outside help from recruitment consultants to find us a new panel of directors, and short biographies have been included within the report, so members are aware of who is being nominated. And of course, 2 members of this committee were on the appointments panel.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. Just before I go to Councillor Page, I just want to say I think it's a great thing that we've had this process and that we've very robustly gone through this recruitment exercise, and I think it's going to be a good thing for the board of RT moving forward. But I'll go to Councillor Page.
Thank you, Chair. And can I firstly put on record my thanks to Councillor Skeets and to Councillor Joe Lovelock for the enormous time and effort that we collectively expended in the appointment process. This is the first time in its history as an arm's length company the council has reviewed the totality of membership of the board. When the company was first set up in 1986 under the august stewardship of myself. We obviously appointed a board, says he modestly, yes. We appointed a board which, as changes arose over the years, we made appointments to replace individuals. But as the years went by, we reached a situation where it was felt appropriate, with a number of retirements because of age and other factors, to review the membership of the non-exec directors. Michael Graham has referred to the earlier report that we had this year. We had a very large number of applicants. I think it was 72 or 73 to be precise, far more than any of us anticipated. That required quite a bit of work around long listing and then short listing and then interviewing. I think we can say that we took this process very seriously, and we were well assisted by Campbell Tickell in this process. There were 4 days of interviewing, 1 day in person for the chair of Reading Buses, the other 3 days online. Whilst we ended up with some very good candidates, I think both Councillor Skeets and myself would have preferred to have done the interviewing in person, but those are the realities of the time. The recommendation before you this evening, Chair, for the new appointments is a unanimous recommendation from all 3 members, and I would commend the range of expertise that we have secured for the future of Reading Buses. I had hoped to have been able to say that the trajectory was continuing upwards, but of course with the latest lockdown or latest advice about home working, all public transport undertakings have reported a decrease in loadings compared with last week, and Reading Buses is no exception. So whether this will be reflected in further financial or extended assistance from the government beyond the end of March, we have yet obviously to find out. But the expertise that these new members bring to the board is one I think that will be of benefit to Reading Buses. We have 2 continuing members, Councillor Stanford Beale and Trish Thomas. And I think the combination of the non-executive directors with a very experienced executive director team offers us good and positive encouragement for the growth and recovery of Reading Buses. So, Chair, I would commend the. Oh, could I just emphasise on the basis of one of his more shorter emails, Councillor Melroy raised the issue of interest. Throughout this process, Councillors Lovelock, Skeets and myself have emphasised at every single stage that we knew some of the applicants, and that interest has been declared, has been transparent and was inevitable, bearing in mind the nature of some of the applicants. Two are continuing on the board. We also had unsuccessful applicants whom we knew. So I would just place that on record, Chair, and I think Mr Graham and other officers would confirm that that declaration has been made at every stage. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Page. Councillor Skeets.
Thank you, Chair. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank Councillor Page for his kind words, and can I just say it was a pleasure once again working cross-party with yourself and on this occasion, Councillor Lovelock. You're right to say that we did declare our interest, knowing certain individuals, and we did that meticulously, and so I thank you for raising that, Councillor Page, tonight, just to again put on the record that we were absolutely putting everything on the record and declaring our interest. What I found was, it's like most interviews, you learn more about the subject, whether it's Brighter Futures that I've sat on in the past, or whether it's, in this case, Reading buses. And I learned quite a lot about Reading buses. And dare I say that I began to get a bit of an interest for it. And it now means that Councillor Stanford Beale and myself, over a glass of sherry or whatever, can talk buses together now. So I learned much about it. Hedging fuel, for one thing, what's this hedging fuel? And so it was an interesting process. What struck me too, and Councillor Page has referred to it, and I echo a lot of the things you've said in your speech tonight, Councillor Page, but one thing that struck me too was the volume of applicants that we received, and I wish we received that level across the board of the council when we put out to recruitment for positions to be filled. It was great, and I must say the quality of the applicants was very good too, and it was an interesting process. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and I would just like to say that I wish the new team, and obviously Reading buses, every good wish for the future. I hope they do well. It's difficult times for them, but I do hope that we have a wonderful bus service in Reading. And I can now talk to Councillor Stanford Beale about the fleet, and I know it's great fun now, but it is a wonderful service that we have in Reading, and I just would like more people to use it. So yes, wish them well for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. I shall watch out for you at the bus stop with your newfound passion for the Councillor Stevens.
Thank you, Chairman. Just an observation here, which is, from what I understand, I had no involvement in the process, but what I do understand is it drew in a lot of very competent, capable people who are all interested in part of this process. And I just wonder to what extent there's an opportunity here to say, look, there are other aspects of the council's business that would potentially equally benefit from a more diverse, wider range of experience. And we might consider, well, how else could we draw upon these people who are prepared to give serious time for, I guess, relatively no remuneration, because it sounded to me like it's a good process. Now, this isn't the proof, is in the doing. It may be in a year or two's time it's a disaster and they can't work together and the whole thing collapses. Let us hope it's successful. I am confident it will be. And I suppose my suggestion is, how else could we then learn from the process, and what other aspects of the business might benefit from similar arrangements?
I suppose it's always worth reflecting on. I think, wherever possible, we wouldn't like to move things into a sort of wholly owned company model if we didn't have to. So clearly it wouldn't be in the sort of directors framework. But and indeed, I suppose you'd have to say that people were applying for a specific position, and so it might not be that they're comparably interested in something else. But I mean, it's good to know that there's something particularly enticing about Reading buses to get that many applications, given, as you've rightly said, that the remuneration for the roles is very low. So it's hardly a kind of, ticket to getting rich or anything like that. So it's reassuring, and I something I'll go away and reflect on a bit as well, I think. Any other comments, colleagues? Anything you need to come back on, Mr. Graham? Okay. Are we okay with the recommended actions here then to appoint? And we should draw some emphasis to 2.4, thanking the outgoing board as well for their work over time, and particularly with the challenges recently, but over a long period in the case of, say, Dave Sutton as chair, we should acknowledge that. Okay. Unanimous? Agreed? Wonderful. Brilliant. Thank you, everybody. Now, unless I'm mistaken, that takes us to the end of the public part of our agenda. So I need to move the exclusion of the press and public as printed, item 13 of the agenda. Are we okay to agree that? Agreed. Wonderful. So I have to ask the gallery to clear. Thank you very much. Yes.